So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Small, and today we're talking about Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense. And for anyone who's tuning in for the first time and doesn't know, all the videos here on Biographics are based on scripts submitted to us by a member of our writing team. And in this case, that is Radu Alexander, who you can follow on the social media links below. And while you're down there, you can like, comment, subscribe. We're doing it earlier in the video than we normally would because YouTube analytics say if I say those three things early enough in the video, they're more likely to happen. It sucks, I know. Let's get to it. Give them pleasure, the same pleasure they have when they wake up from a nightmare. That's a quote from Alfred Hitchcock, and it immediately gives people a little insight into his approach to filmmaking, even if they've never seen one of his movies before. And spoilers, you've probably seen one of his movies before, and if you've not seen one of his movies, you've seen a parody of one of his movies or a remake. Like, if you've watched The Simpsons, you've seen Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock was the so-called master of suspense, a title he clings to even now more than half a century after his best works came out. His greatest movies are masterpieces that perfectly blend thrills, mystery and romance to create timeless viewing experiences. There aren't many classic directors whose filmography is still so well regarded and popular in modern times. So today we're going to take a look at the stunning career and the troublesome personal life of Alfred Hitchcock. And we start, as we always do, at the beginning. Alfred Joseph Hitchcock was born August 13, 1899 in London's Leytonstone district. The youngest of three children of William Hitchcock and Emma Jane Whelan, his father worked as a greengrocer like his father before him, and both his parents were devout Catholics who enforced a strict upbringing. Later in life, Hitchcock, or Hitch as his friends would call him, remembered his childhood as lonely and somewhat sheltered, not really having any friends or mates, as we say in Britain, growing up. He partly attributed this to his obesity, which he blamed on his mother, who used food as a remedy for most of his problems. Meanwhile, Alfred's father was something of a disciplinarian, and one story that Hitchcock would recount multiple times as an adult was one occasion when he was 5 years old, and his father sent him down to the local police station with a note asking the sergeant on duty to lock the young Alfred in jail for a few minutes to show him what happened to naughty little boys. And this sort of worked, we guess, because Hitchcock developed a severe fear of having anything to do with the law, and even as an adult, he wouldn't even drive a car out of fear he would get a ticket. The same education continued at school, as Hitchcock attended the St. Ignatius College, a Jesuit secondary school in Stamford Hill, where corporal punishment was the norm whenever the pupils acted out of line. Afterwards, Hitchcock enrolled in night classes at a technical school where he studied engineering and navigation. His father died in 1914, and with his older siblings out of the house, Alfred had to get a day job during this time to support himself and his mother. He found one with the Henley Telegraph and Cable Company as a technical clerk, and he was too young to join World War I, and when he did come of age in 1917, he received a C3 classification, basically a low grade in fitness, and he was excused from military service, so instead he enlisted as in volunteer group of the Royal Engineers. Although initially Hitchcock displayed interest in engineering, as the years went on he quickly developed his artistic side, finding a talent for drawing as he became a draftsman who made technical plans and sketches. He continued his night studies, this time focused on illustrations and graphic design, and this kind of dedication did not go unnoticed in his workplace. Hitchcock was promoted to Henley's advertising department, where he served as a jack-of-all-trades dog's body. He wrote, he edited for the company's newspaper and magazine advertisements, he arranged their layout, and he drew the graphic illustrations when he felt like it. He further expanded his artistic range by writing short stories and articles, and even drawing caricatures for the company's new in-house magazine, The Henley, which started publishing in June 1919. And if he really wanted to, Hitchcock could have probably just had a nice, long, safe career at Henley. He loved the job, and the company made it pretty clear he was a very valued employee. But still, he chafed, and the more he leaned into his artistic side, the more he wanted to make that his full-time job. Being there, he developed a strong passion for the new exciting form of art called movie making, and would spend many an evening down at his local theatre, and then back home when he would read all the latest trade magazines. Then in 1920 he saw an announcement that would change his life forever. Famous Players Lasky, the American movie company that would later become Paramount Pictures, was going to open up a new studio in London. That will be my golden ticket, thought Hitchcock, so that same year he abandoned his safe, cushy job at Henley and embarked on a path to become a movie maker. Oh, hi there! Before we continue with today's video about Alfred Hitchcock, let's take a word from our sponsor, Skillshare. And guys, behind the scenes, because this is a team effort here at Biographics, tell me more about Skillshare and why we're specifically putting in this video.
Well, Skillshare, if people are unaware, is an online learning community which has thousands of classes and members.
Yes.
What Skillshare can teach you is very relevant to today's video topic. I personally have a fascination with Hitchcock and his work. I think that he was obviously a fascinating director. And obviously his films are... I mean, he's considered one of the best directors of all time.
The master of suspense, yes.
So when I found out that this was going to be the video that we were going to be putting the spot in, I actually had a look myself on Skillshare to see what kind of courses could you do to be a bit more like Hitchcock.
Yes.
And I found one by an author called Benjamin Percy, which is called Writing Suspense, How to Write Stories That Thrill in Any Genre. It sounds like a very good course for anybody who wants to learn how to write specifically suspense, just like Hitchcock did.
They also have cooking courses, so you can get the physique of Hitchcock as well.
I imagine they would also have cooking courses.
The legendary Hitchcockian physique. So rotund. Such a round, large man.
The good thing about Skillshare as well is that the classes aren't just for professionals, or they're not just for beginners. There is a range for people who want to learn all different areas.
Yes, I think that's the key thing as well, because like there's always that weird middle ground, isn't there? It's like, I know the basics, I'm not a professional, I'm somewhere in the middle, and there's always wiggle room there to improve upon the skills that you have, just to make things more efficient, just to or even just brushing up the skills that you already have.
You also come out at the end with a completed project that you can share, which is good. Are you enjoying yourself?
I love playing with my Antics, yes. It's very fun.
I've had a look at the classes myself, and being a creative person, as I like to call myself a creative person,
oh yeah,
there's so many classes that I want to try. Like, I really like drawing, so I'd want to get back into art. There's photography, I could really improve my photography skills. Like illustration and graphic design as well. There's just so many like classes that just sounds so interesting and fun.
I think the operative word there, Nisha, is fun, because learning is fun, and Skillshare can help make learning fun. So thank you to today's sponsor, Skillshare, and the first 500 people to use my link will get 1 month free trial of the service. And as a thank you to our audience, here's a little extra bonus fact for you. Guys, did you know that Steven Spielberg laughed at the Jaws theme when he first heard it? The story goes that when Steven Spielberg commissioned John Williams to create a theme for Jaws, he wanted it to be more swashbuckling in nature, because the film ultimately, so it's a film on the sea, like, you know, guys on a boat hunting a big shark. He wanted like a triumphant, swashbuckling, loud, extravagant theme. And when John Williams came in and said, "I've got it, Steve," and he went, "Dun."
Just 2 notes.
2 notes on a piano, dun. Dun, 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 dun. And Steven Spielberg burst out laughing and said, "You can't be serious, John." No, trust me. And obviously this is John Williams we're talking about, so Steven Spielberg said, "Okay, I'll trust you. We'll put your theme over, like, you know, the shark scene, see how audiences react." Audiences screamed so loud that you couldn't hear the film, and Steven Spielberg just looked at John Williams and said, "Okay, I trust you." And they put the theme in. Isn't that fun? Back to the video. Actually, no, back to you, Karl. The first movie that famous Players Lasky was supposed to film in London was called The Sorrow of Satan, based on the Marie Corelli novel. So Hitchcock went home and drew a bunch of sketches that could be used for title cards during the movie. This being the era of silent film, title cards were a pretty important part of the film, and were often suggestive of the theme, plot, and were very intricately decorated. Afterwards, Hitch went to the studio and just started showing them to people at random, hoping that anyone would like them enough to give him a job. Just one problem though, the studio had changed its mind and wasn't making that film anymore. Instead, it was going to make a different movie called The Great Day. Undaunted, Hitchcock went back home and did the exact same thing again, this time coming back with a bunch of title cards that were altogether more uplifting and inspiring and a bit lighter on the whole Satan theme. The next day, he was back at the studio, and this time his efforts did pay off. The execs liked his work and his tenacity and hired the 20-year-old Hitchcock as a title card designer. And over the next few years, Hitchcock worked on all the movies that famous Players Lasky shot in London, most of them now lost forever. From title card designer, he got promoted to art director, although he also dabbled in script writing and set design. For anyone curious about how he was able to do this, there were no unions back then, so anyone could do pretty much anything as long as they're asked to do it and had the inclination to do so. Then in 1922 came his big break. Hitchcock was asked to direct his first movie. At least it was supposed to be his big break, and it's quite fitting for the so-called master of suspense that his first movie is shrouded in a cloak of mystery, as not even the name of the movie he worked on is quite certain. For anyone curious, Hitchcock himself would later note that the movie he worked on first was called Number 13. very mysterious. But studio records say it was actually a movie called Mrs. Peabody. The movie was never finished, and whatever bits were filmed are lost forever. So the Hollywood studio's British excursion had been a financial failure, and it closed down its London offices while Hitchcock was still filming his directorial debut. As a small consolation prize, Hitchcock did get a chance the following year to finish directing an independent British production titled Always Tell Your Wife after the original director left. And as a bigger consolation prize still, Hitchcock's skills, experience and talent were good enough that he immediately found work with a trio of British producers who were trying to get a new film company off the ground and made him the head of their title department. Like before, Hitchcock did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, pretty much a little bit of everything. He wrote a screenplay about a movie titled Woman to Woman, and the execs liked it so much they also appointed Hitchcock as the art director and the AD for the picture. More importantly, this was the movie where Hitchcock met and fell in love with an editor named Alma Reville. They married in 1926 and stayed married until he died in 1980. The couple had one daughter named Patricia together, who had a few small roles in her father's movies, much in the same way that he did, but more on that later in the video. To top it all off, Woman on Woman was a success and helped found Gainsborough Pictures. Hitchcock's status in the company grew steadily over the next few years, even travelling to Germany to work on a few movies there and gain some extra experience. Then, in 1925, Hitchcock had the opportunity to direct again, a British-German silent drama titled The Pleasure Garden. This was his true directorial debut, and the movie was well received enough that Hitchcock was already being hailed as one of Britain's promising young directors. So, unsurprisingly, he got more directing gigs after that. He still worked as a co-writer on many of his screenplays, but the title designing and art direction were left to somebody else, somebody less important. The 1927 movie The Lodger, the story of London fog, gave the world the first taste of the thrills and suspense that would define Alfred Hitchcock's later career. The movie essentially told the tale of a Jack the Ripper-style serial killer who preyed on young blondes at night. It featured a landlady who suspected her lodger of being the murderer, although he turned out to be innocent. It would later be reported that Hitchcock would have preferred for the guilt of the lodger to be left ambiguous, because that makes for an altogether more interesting story. But since he was being played by Ivor Novello, Gainsborough's biggest matinee idol, the studio wanted to make it clear that their star was not a villain. Hitchcock would later run into pretty much the exact same problem a decade and a half later in Hollywood with Cary Grant in Suspicion. Despite this minor setback, The Lodger was still a hit, and it featured many elements that would come to define Hitchcock as a filmmaker, including his first cameo as an extra in the background, but more on that later. The next few years represented a series of highs and some lows for the director. There were bright spots such as The Ring, considered one of Hitchcock's best silent movies, and there were a few stinkers such as Champagne and The Farmer's Wife. His 1929 movie Blackmail is sometimes heralded as the first British talkie. While this isn't technically true, and there was a poorly made, unsuccessful short called The Clue of the New Pin before it, Blackmail was the movie that showed the British public that sound had arrived. During the 1930s, Hitchcock followed the success of Blackmail with a series of films that weren't quite so memorable. Feeling the need for a change, the director moved to a new studio and signed a contract with Gaumont British in 1933. Immediately, this new pairing led to much success, with Hitch's first movie at Gaumont, The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring Peter Lorre, not to confuse the movie of the same name that Hitchcock would make 2 decades later, starring James Stewart and Doris Day. But his second effort was even better, a screen adaptation of John Buchanan's spy thriller novel, The 39 Steps. Many fans and critics would argue that this was not only the first true Hitchcock classic, but also the best film he made in Britain. We cannot get around the fact that although Alfred Hitchcock the director was undeniably brilliant, Alfred Hitchcock the man was a prick, to put it mildly. His behaviour towards the people around him could range from mild-mannered japery to bullying and downright sadistic abuse. And we'll get on to his conduct towards some of his blonde female stars, particularly Tippi Hedren, a bit later, but for now let's focus on some of the tricks he liked to play on people. So Hitchcock had developed a reputation as something of a prankster, both on set and in his private life. Some of these were relatively harmless, like putting whoopee cushions on people's chairs, or loudly telling an interesting anecdote in a busy elevator and then leaving right before the punchline. The master of suspense, everybody. But some of his antics straddled the border between unacceptable and just like, oh, go on then. Like throwing a dinner party where all the food had been coloured blue or sending a live horse to the dressing room of an actor. But some of the stuff Hitchcock did was abuse, plain and simple. He was particularly cruel if you knew you suffered from some kind of phobia. You could almost guarantee that he would work it into some sort of prank, which was pretty sick and kind of hypocritical coming from a guy with ovophobia, the fear of eggs. Yes? The master of suspense and a man who looked remarkably like an egg was scared of eggs. And perhaps the meanest trick Hitchcock ever played on someone that we're aware of is when a crew member bet the director a week's salary that he would not be afraid to spend a night alone in the dark studio chained to his camera. At the end of the day, the handcuffs went on and Hitchcock left with a key, but not before getting the man a nice bottle of brandy to keep him warm throughout the night. What the crew member did not know, though, is that Hitchcock had laced the brandy with the strongest laxative he could find, which led to, shall we say, predictable results. The next day, they found the crew member crying in a pool of his own excrement, and Hitchcock was laughing uproariously at the sight. When the poor man was freed from his bondage and shamefully shuffled off to the changing rooms to clean himself, Hitchcock did pay the bet, but told him never to mess with him again. But back to the movies, the second half of the decade saw Hitchcock make 5 more films. Some of them were good and some of them were meh. Like Sabotage and The Lady Vanishes are both regarded as some of Hitchcock's best work in Britain, but his final film in the UK for the time being, a 1939 adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn, was met with a tepid reception. Then a new decade dawned, and so did a giant leap forward for the career of Alfred Hitchcock, as Hollywood came a-calling. So in 1939, Hitchcock was lured by the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, plus, a big fat check and a wad of cash. And he moved to Los Angeles, where he signed a contract with big shot producer David L. Selznick, who just a few years prior had left MGM and started his own independent studio, Selznick International Pictures. So not exactly one that rolls off the tongue, but sure, he had money. It wasn't around for long, but it lasted long enough to make Gone with the Wind and firmly established Selznick as one of the most important men in all of Hollywood. Curiously, even though Hitchcock's previous film, Jamaica Inn, didn't exactly set the cinematic world on fire for his first Hollywood project, the director chose another adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's novel. This time it was Rebecca, starring Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. It received a much better reception, to put it mildly, by which we mean it was nominated for 11 Oscars that year, including Hitchcock's first of 5 nominations for Best Director. And Rebecca also won an Oscar for Best Picture, the only film in Hitchcock's filmography to do so. And just a little bonus aside here, because it's not mentioned in the script, but it's still an interesting tidbit about Hitchcock. He holds the joint record for shortest speech ever made at the Oscars, where he simply walked onto the stage in 1968 when he received an award of some kind, looked at the audience after they'd finished clapping and said, "Thank you," and then walked off the stage. I believe Cary Grant also did something similar a few years prior. Moving on, his follow-up efforts were pretty good but unlikely to be included in Hitchcock's highlight reel anytime soon. The spy thriller Foreign Correspondent and the comedy Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which, yes, is the same film that was remade starring Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. Hitchcock had another problem because Selznick didn't really have that much work for him to do. His studio was still relatively small, and it only made a few films each year, so the producer loaned Hitchcock to other companies such as RKO Pictures and 20th Century Fox. And it was actually RKO that the director made his next big hit for, Suspicion, reuniting him with Joan Fontaine and representing the first of 4 collaborations with Cary Grant. As we mentioned earlier, this was a rare occasion where Grant played a sinister character, but the studio was adamant that he could not be the murderer, even though that was the case in the book the movie was based on. So despite occasionally butting heads with the studio execs, the 1940s were a successful and productive decade for Hitchcock. And there are not a lot of stinkers on his resume that decade. Under Capricorn was probably the worst movie, at least critically, and The Paradigm Case received mixed reviews as well, but other than that, the filmography is looking pretty solid. In 1942, Hitch made the spy thriller Saboteur, which was followed by the classic Shadow of a Doubt in 1943. Fun fact, this was Hitchcock's personal favourite movie, and according to his daughter, this is because the director loved the idea of taking a quiet, small town and injecting it with some menace. His next 2 movies were Lifeboat and Spellbound, and although nowadays they don't immediately spring to mind when you think of Hitchcock, they both garnered him 2 more Oscar nominations for Best Director. They also featured interesting collaborations for the master of suspense. Lifeboat was based on a story written by John Steinbeck specifically for the movie, while Spellbound included a dream sequence designed by famed artist Salvador Dali. In 1947, Hitchcock's contract with Selznick ended and he founded his own independent production company, Transatlantic Pictures, to have more control over his project. But this is Hitchcock we're talking about, and he of course ended his contract with a bang. The 1946 spy film noir Notorious, starring 2 of Hitchcock's favourite actors, Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. Again, it was another Hitchcock classic, although Selznick didn't really see it that way. First, he wanted to replace Grant with Joseph Cotten because he was cheaper. Then he didn't like the idea of a plot involving a uranium bomb because he thought it sounded like, and I quote, science fiction. This was a few months before America dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ultimately, Selznick became so uninterested that he sold the whole production package, like script, director, actors and all, to RKO Pictures out of nowhere. Hitchcock did not have a very good time with Transatlantic Pictures. In fact, many would argue it was the nadir of his career. The production company only lasted for a few years and made a handful of movies that didn't really open to the kind of critical or commercial reception that was up to Hitchcock's reputation at the time. We should also mention that 2 of those movies have received more complimentary modern reassessment and now regarded as underrated Hitchcock classics. One of them was Strangers on a Train, like my personal favourite Hitchcock movie, an adaptation of Patricia Highsmith's debut novel, and the other was Rope, Hitchcock's first collaboration with James Stewart. It was also his first colour film. Well, Hitchcock might have had a few missteps at Transatlantic, but ultimately it didn't matter because he was about to enter the absolute peak of his career that solidified Alfred Hitchcock as one of the greatest filmmakers in modern movie history. Hitchcock kicked off his cinematographic zenith with his Grace Kelly trilogy, 3 movies starring the future Princess of Monaco, Dial M for Murder, To Catch a Thief, and last but certainly not least, Rear Window. All of them great films, especially the last one, which is frequently ranked one of the best movies ever made. Around the same time, the director produced and hosted a television anthology series dubbed Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and it was a big hit that went on for 10 years and over 360 episodes. But it also turned Hitchcock himself into a celebrity. And at the time, people saw directors as just a name on a screen before a movie they actually cared about started, but with his rotund physique and dry, witty sense of humour and English accent, just Hitchcock cut a quite interesting and novel figure, and as a result became quite memorable and a household name. The director followed up Rear Window with 3 more good but not great movies: The Trouble with Harry, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and The Wrong Man. They still made for entertaining viewing, but had the misfortune of being sandwiched between Hitchcock's Grace Kelly trio and the new trilogy that genuinely represents perhaps the career performance of any filmmaker ever. So the year is 1958, followed by 1959 and 1960. That's 3 years, and in those 3 years, Hitchcock made 3 movies. Those movies were Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho. At the time, like, everyone knows Psycho, right? You say the term Psycho, I was like, like, everybody knows Psycho. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least talk a little bit about the production of Psycho, because it's genuinely fascinating. So Psycho was like the directorial follow-up to North by Northwest, this huge bombastic colour movie. And when Hitchcock pitched Psycho, the studio were not impressed by it at all, and they were very, very keen to get Hitchcock to do something else, so much so that Hitchcock basically had to underbid himself. So first he agreed to not take his usual directorial fee, and they were like, no, it's still too much money. Then he told them, okay, so I won't use his film crew, I'll use the crew from my TV show, that'll be cheaper, right? And said, no, it's still too expensive. Okay, I'll make it in black and white. And so, okay, black and white film is cheaper. And then when he was making Psycho, he basically invented what we'd understand today to be viral marketing, by engaging in a series of publicity stunts to just hide what the ending of the movie was, starting with buying as many copies of the novel the film was based on as possible and then publicizing that fact. And when asked why, so I don't want anyone to know the ending. Then he released a series of trailers that, rather than showing the movie itself, simply had him walk out into frame and tell people that if they didn't turn up to the movie on time, the doors would be closed and they would be unable to attend that screening. Obviously, once you've reached the top, there's nowhere really to go but down. And although admittedly it was a gentle slope for Hitchcock, his next movie was The Birds, which, while not well received when it came out, its standing has improved somewhat with time and is widely considered one of Hitchcock's best and most memorable works. But the most disturbing aspect of the production, though, was the director's weird, obsessive relationship with the leading lady, Tippi Hedren. And this would reportedly continue into the production of their next film together, Marnie. And it's worth noting that after Hitchcock's death, Tippi Hedren would accuse him of being cruel and abusive to her in person and sexually assaulting her in private when she rebuffed his advances. He even threatened to ruin her career. It's undoubtedly a darker chapter in Hitchcock's life that often spurs that age-old debate on whether or not you should separate art from artists. So bring it back to the art. Hitchcock was entering the twilight of his career. He'd been a prolific director, shooting on average 1 film a year since 1925. However, he was getting old and had never exactly been at the peak of physical health. However, his wife Alma was in even worse condition, having been left partially paralysed following 2 strokes, and Hitchcock didn't really want to leave her alone for extended periods of time. Between 1966 and 1976, he only made 4 films: Torn Curtain, Topaz, Frenzy, and Family Plot. Most reviews are mixed, with the occasional praise, especially for Frenzy, which Hitchcock got to film back in his native London. In his later years, the director's health seriously declined, but he got to enjoy one last honour before passing away. In January 1980, he was given a knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II, although he was too ill to travel to England to receive it. Hitchcock died just a few months later on April 29th, age 80, leaving behind a tricky legacy to define. If you look at it solely based on his filmography, then you are undoubtedly looking at one of the greatest filmmakers who has ever lived. However, if you take into account Alfred Hitchcock the person, and remember all the stories of abuse on and off set, then Hitchcock becomes a flawed, even sadistic figure who was really, really good when he sat in the director's chair and a pretty terrible person when he was out of it. As is often the case with many figures throughout history. So I hope everyone at home enjoyed this video and found it entertaining, informative, and educational. I certainly found the script to be all 3 of those things, and encourage everyone at home to follow the author Radu Alexander on the socials linked below. You can follow me if you feel like it, but I don't really post all that much. I also have my own channel, Fact Theme with Karl Smallwood, and contribute to Wiki Weekend with my friend Lucas. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you have anything to say or some feedback, suggestions for other figures to cover, maybe some other stories from Hitchcock's career we didn't cover here, or trivia about his movies, we'd be excited to hear them and can respond to them in the comments below, or maybe pin one to the top. I don't know. I don't run that part of the channel, but I'm always excited to read trivia about movies. If you can't tell, it's a personal passion of mine. Otherwise, I hope everyone out there has a great day, and as always, I hope everybody out there enjoyed the video, and as I always like to say, have the day you all deserve. Cheers.